He stands in the kitchen at 6 a.m, preparing her elaborate coffee order with oat milk and 3 specific sugar substitutes, while mentally rehearsing how to ask permission to play golf this weekend. 2 years ago, he was the guy who called the shots, made the plans, and led the relationship. Now he's strategically timing conversations to avoid conflicts and constantly calculating which version of himself will get the best response. The transformation happened so gradually he can't pinpoint when it started. Maybe it was when he agreed to skip Guy's night to attend her friend's dinner party. Maybe it was when he stopped choosing restaurants because you're better at picking places we'll both like. Maybe it was when he started asking, "Is this okay?" instead of saying, "This is what we're doing." What he knows for certain is that somewhere along the way he stopped being the driver of his own relationship and became a passenger trying to keep the driver happy. He went from being someone she was excited to follow to someone desperately trying to figure out where she wants to go and how to get her there without upsetting her. You know this man. Maybe you are this man. The guy who has somehow become subordinate in his own relationship while trying to be a good partner. The man who gave up his natural leadership in exchange for what he thought was love, but feels increasingly like management. The person who discovered that the more he tries to make her happy, the less happy both of them become. Today, I'm going to expose the psychological trap that destroys more relationships than cheating, financial problems, and incompatibility combined. Because what I'm about to reveal will explain why being a considerate partner can kill attraction, why giving women what they ask for often makes them want to leave, and why the relationships that last longest are those where men understand the counterintuitive dynamics of power, leadership, and attraction. Here's the devastating truth about modern relationships. The majority of them operate under an inverted power structure where the person with less investment controls the person with more investment, creating psychological dynamics that satisfy neither party and doom the relationship to slow death through resentment and lost attraction. This inversion happens because men have been taught that good relationships are democratic partnerships, where both people have equal say in all decisions, equal power over outcomes, and equal responsibility for managing the emotional climate. This sounds fair and progressive, but it ignores fundamental psychological realities about how attraction, respect, and long-term satisfaction actually function. The crisis manifests when the person who should be providing direction, creating experiences and making decisions gradually transfers that authority to someone who doesn't actually want it, but will accept it to avoid conflict. She ends up with power she doesn't desire, while he ends up with submission he can't sustain. What makes this inversion so insidious is how reasonable each individual step appears. She suggests where to go for dinner because she has dietary restrictions. He defers to her social calendar because she's better at coordinating with friends. She manages the household decisions because she cares more about interior design. Each concession seems logical in isolation, but the cumulative effect is that he becomes a supporting character in his own life, constantly seeking approval for decisions that should be his to make, asking permission for activities that should be his to choose, and managing her emotions instead of living his authentic life. The inversion creates what I call relationship anxiety disorder, where both people become chronically dissatisfied but can't identify why. She feels burdened by having to manage everything and disappointed by his lack of leadership. He feels controlled and emasculated but guilty for resenting her management of their life. This crisis explains why many relationships that look perfect from the outside feel hollow from the inside. They've achieved equality by eliminating the natural dynamic tensions that create attraction, excitement, and mutual satisfaction. They've become business partnerships managing logistics rather than romantic relationships generating chemistry. Men lose leadership in relationships through two distinct pathways, each with different origins but identical outcomes. Understanding these pathways is crucial because the prevention strategies differ depending on which path you're on, but both lead to the same destination, a relationship where she holds all the cards and you're constantly trying to figure out how to play your hand. The first pathway is immediate subordination, where men surrender leadership from the very beginning as a strategy to attract women who might otherwise be out of their league. This happens when men believe their only competitive advantage is being more accommodating, more flexible, and more willing to defer than more attractive alternatives. These men essentially bid for relationships by offering privileges and concessions that more confident men wouldn't provide. They become what I call premium service providers in the dating market, competing on convenience and accommodation rather than attraction and leadership. The strategy feels logical in the short term because it does create initial access to women who might not otherwise be interested. The problem is that the foundation of the relationship becomes his willingness to subordinate himself to her preferences, creating a dynamic where his value is tied to his compliance rather than his character. The second pathway is gradual erosion, where men enter relationships with natural leadership but slowly transfer authority through small compromises that seem reasonable individually but are catastrophic cumulatively. This is actually more common because most men do possess leadership instincts initially. This erosion typically follows a predictable pattern. In the beginning, he makes plans, chooses activities, and leads interactions because that's what feels natural and what initially attracted her. But as emotional investment increases and the desire to avoid conflict grows, he begins deferring to her preferences to maintain harmony. Each individual concession feels minor and justified. Skip one guy's night to attend her event. Choose her preferred restaurant instead of yours. Adjust your weekend plans to accommodate her schedule. Accept her friend group's activities instead of suggesting your own. None of these decisions seem significant alone, but the cumulative effect is leadership death by 1,000 small submissions. Eventually he realizes he can't remember the last time he made a unilateral decision about their shared life, and she's lost respect for someone who constantly seeks her approval for choices he should be making independently. The most dangerous moment in any relationship is when a man becomes emotionally overinvested while believing that demonstrating this investment through increased accommodation and decreased boundaries will strengthen the bond. This creates what I call the emotional investment trap, where the very behavior intended to secure the relationship actually destroys it. Emotional overinvestment distorts decision-making in ways that men don't recognize until the damage is irreversible. When you care too much about keeping her, you start optimizing for her immediate comfort rather than long-term relationship health. When you're terrified of losing her, you start managing her emotions instead of expressing your authentic preferences. This trap is particularly insidious because society tells men that emotional investment equals relationship commitment, and that demonstrated commitment should increase their value as partners. Men believe that showing how much they care will make women care more in return, creating a feedback loop of increasing investment and decreasing return. The trap operates through what psychologists call loss aversion, where the fear of losing something valuable becomes more powerful than the desire to gain something valuable. Once men become emotionally overinvested, they start making decisions based on avoiding loss rather than creating gains. This shift changes everything about how they show up in the relationship. Instead of creating experiences she can join, they start asking what experiences she wants. Instead of leading interactions, they start following her emotional cues. Instead of maintaining their own interests and boundaries, they start molding themselves into whatever they think she wants. The most destructive aspect of this trap is how it creates the opposite of what both people actually want. He wants to feel valued and respected for who he is, but his overinvestment leads him to become someone he's not. She wants to feel attracted to and excited by her partner, but his accommodation eliminates the natural tensions and leadership that create those feelings. Emotional overinvestment also creates vulnerability to manipulation, whether conscious or unconscious. When someone knows you're terrified of losing them, they hold disproportionate power over your decisions, your behavior, and your sense of self-worth. This power imbalance is toxic for both people, but particularly devastating for the overinvested party. Once a man demonstrates that his decisions can be influenced by her emotional reactions, a predictable cycle begins where requests start small and reasonable, but escalate in frequency and significance until he's living a life he doesn't recognize as his own. This cycle operates so gradually that most men don't notice the pattern until they're completely trapped. The cycle typically begins with requests that seem entirely reasonable and easy to accommodate. Maybe she asks him to choose a different restaurant because she's not in the mood for what he suggested. Maybe she requests that he adjust his weekend plans to attend her friend's birthday party. Maybe she wants him to skip his gym session to spend time together. Each individual request appears minor and justified. She's not asking for anything unreasonable, and accommodating her seems like normal relationship compromise. The problem isn't the specific requests. It's the precedent each accommodation sets for future negotiations about his autonomy and decision-making authority. The escalation happens because each successful request teaches her that his boundaries are negotiable and that emotional pressure can be used to override his preferences. She learns that disappointed reactions, frustrated sighs, or expressions of hurt feelings can be converted into compliance with her preferences. Meanwhile, he learns that saying no creates emotional turbulence, while saying yes creates temporary peace. This conditioning gradually trains him to default to accommodation rather than authenticity, creating a pattern where her emotional state becomes more important than his actual preferences. The cycle accelerates as the requests become larger and more frequent. What started with occasional suggestions about dinner choices evolves into expectations about how he spends his free time, manages his friendships, structures his work schedule, and expresses his personality. The cumulative effect is that his entire life becomes subject to her approval. The most insidious aspect of this cycle is how it reframes normal male independence as selfishness and normal boundary setting as inconsideration. He begins to believe that prioritizing his own preferences, maintaining his own interests, or making unilateral decisions about his own life constitutes bad partnership. Eventually, the cycle reaches a point where he needs permission for activities that should be entirely within his autonomous decision-making authority. He can't make plans with friends, pursue hobbies, or even manage his own schedule without navigating her emotional reactions and securing her approval. Once men become trapped in accommodation patterns, their decision-making shifts from authentic preference-based choices to fear-based calculations designed to avoid negative emotional consequences. This creates what I call a fear-based decision matrix, where every choice is filtered through predictions about her potential reactions rather than his actual desires. This matrix operates like a sophisticated prediction algorithm that constantly calculates the emotional costs and benefits of various choices. Should I go out with my friends tonight? The matrix evaluates her likely response, the potential for conflict, the energy required to manage her disappointment, and the probability that accommodation will create more harmony than authenticity. The matrix becomes so automatic that men stop consulting their own preferences entirely. They don't ask themselves what they want to do, they ask themselves what she wants them to want to do. They don't consider what would make them happy, they consider what would avoid making her unhappy. This fear-based decision-making creates what psychologists call learned helplessness, where men become convinced that their authentic choices will inevitably create relationship problems. They develop anxiety around normal self-determination because they've been conditioned to believe that independence equals conflict. The matrix also creates decision paralysis, where men become unable to make simple choices without extensive analysis of potential emotional ramifications. Choosing a restaurant becomes a complex negotiation. Planning a weekend becomes a strategic challenge. Maintaining friendships becomes a diplomatic mission. Most destructively, the fear-based matrix trains men to abandon their instincts and ignore their preferences in favor of emotional management strategies. They lose touch with their authentic selves while becoming experts at reading her emotional weather patterns and adjusting their behavior accordingly. The matrix ultimately fails because relationships based on fear-based compliance rather than authentic choice cannot generate the respect, attraction, and satisfaction that healthy partnerships require. Both people end up unsatisfied, she with a partner who lacks conviction and leadership, and he with a life that feels completely foreign to his natural personality. If you're starting to recognize these patterns in your own relationship and want to understand how to restore healthy dynamics before it's too late, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. The psychological dynamics I'm explaining today represent the difference between relationships that thrive and relationships that slowly die through accommodation and compromise, and there's much more depth to explore in upcoming videos about attraction, leadership, and relationship psychology. Here's the most counterintuitive truth about relationship dynamics. The behaviors that men believe will make women love them more, accommodation, flexibility, constant consideration of her feelings, are often the exact behaviors that make women lose attraction and respect for them. This creates what I call the authenticity paradox, where trying to be a better partner actually makes you a worse partner. The paradox operates because women are initially attracted to men who demonstrate leadership, confidence, and the ability to make decisions independently. These qualities signal competence, strength, and the capacity to handle life's challenges. But once men become emotionally invested, they often abandon these very qualities in favor of consensus building and emotional management. This abandonment happens because men misunderstand what creates lasting attraction. They believe that demonstrating how much they care through increased accommodation will deepen the bond, but the opposite occurs. The more they accommodate, the less attractive they become, because accommodation signals that her approval has become more important than their own integrity. The paradox also operates through what I call attraction erosion, where the qualities that initially drew her to him gradually disappear through his efforts to maintain her interest. He becomes less decisive because he's constantly seeking her input. He becomes less confident because he's constantly monitoring her reactions. He becomes less independent because he's constantly managing her emotions. Women experience this paradox as losing respect for someone who has lost respect for himself. When a man consistently prioritizes her emotional comfort over his own authentic preferences, she begins to see him as weak, needy, and lacking in the strength that initially attracted her to him. The most frustrating aspect of this paradox is how it punishes men for good intentions. They're genuinely trying to be considerate partners, but their consideration is interpreted as weakness. They're authentically attempting to make the relationship work, but their efforts make the relationship less functional. Understanding this paradox requires recognizing that attraction is not based on how well you cater to someone's expressed preferences, but on how consistently you maintain your own identity, boundaries, and decision-making authority while inviting them to join your life rather than subordinating your life to theirs. Understanding relationship dynamics becomes clearer when viewed through the lens of organizational leadership. Just as successful companies require clear leadership structures to function effectively, successful relationships require one person to take primary responsibility for direction, decision-making, and maintaining the overall vision of the partnership. In business, leaders who constantly seek consensus on every decision create confusion, inefficiency, and loss of respect from their teams. Employees want leaders who can make tough decisions, provide clear direction, and take responsibility for outcomes. The same psychological principles apply to romantic relationships. This doesn't mean authoritarian control or dismissing her input. It means taking ultimate responsibility for the direction and management of the relationship while considering her feedback and preferences within that framework. Just as good business leaders consult with their teams while maintaining final decision-making authority, the business analogy also explains why accommodation strategies ultimately fail. Companies that give employees everything they ask for don't create loyal, satisfied teams. They create entitled, demanding workers who lose respect for leadership, that can't maintain boundaries or make difficult decisions when necessary. Similarly, relationships where men consistently defer to women's preferences don't create grateful, loving partners. They create frustrated women who lose attraction to men who can't provide the leadership and direction that healthy relationships require. The analogy helps men understand that saying no sometimes isn't cruel or inconsiderate. It's necessary for maintaining the structure and dynamics that make relationships function effectively. Just as businesses must sometimes deny employee requests to maintain profitability and sustainability. Understanding this business framework also helps men recognize that being in a leadership position often means making decisions that others don't initially like, but that serve the long-term interests of the organization, or in this case, the relationship. Escaping the accommodation trap requires developing what I call a maintenance methodology, a systematic approach to preserving your leadership, authenticity, and decision-making authority throughout the natural evolution of romantic relationships. This methodology operates on specific principles that prevent the gradual erosion of attraction and respect. The first principle is preference assertion, where you consistently express and act on your authentic preferences rather than constantly deferring to hers. This doesn't mean being selfish or inconsiderate. It means being honest about what you want and willing to pursue it even when she might prefer alternatives. The second principle is emotional non-management, where you stop taking responsibility for regulating her emotions and start allowing her to experience and process her own emotional responses to your decisions. This means being comfortable with her disappointment, frustration, or disagreement without immediately moving to fix or prevent these feelings. The third principle is decision independence, where you maintain areas of your life that are entirely within your autonomous control and don't require her input or approval. This includes friendships, hobbies, career decisions, and personal choices that affect you primarily rather than both of you. The fourth principle is early intervention, where you address boundary violations and accommodation pressures when they first appear, rather than waiting until patterns are established. Small compromises of authenticity are much easier to correct than major lifestyle changes that have become normalized over time. The methodology also requires consequence tolerance, where you accept that maintaining your authenticity might sometimes create relationship tension, and that this tension is healthier than the gradual death of attraction that comes from constant accommodation. Most importantly, the methodology involves long-term thinking, where you make decisions based on what will create sustainable attraction and respect over years, rather than what will create immediate emotional comfort or conflict avoidance. Healthy relationships require clear power dynamics, but not the authoritarian control that many people fear when they hear male leadership. Instead, they require what I call consensual authority, where one person takes primary responsibility for relationship direction, while the other person chooses to support and follow that leadership. These dynamics work because they align with deep psychological patterns that create attraction, security, and satisfaction for both people. When men provide competent leadership, women feel secure enough to be feminine and receptive. When women support male leadership, men feel respected enough to be generous and protective. The power dynamics become toxic only when they are imposed rather than chosen, or when leadership becomes controlling rather than directing. Healthy male leadership creates experiences and opportunities that women want to participate in, rather than rules and restrictions that women must endure. Understanding these dynamics requires recognizing that equality in relationships doesn't mean identical roles and responsibilities. It means equal value and importance with different areas of specialty and authority. Just as business partnerships can be equal while having different roles and decision-making areas, the reality is that someone has to make final decisions when couples disagree, someone has to take responsibility when things go wrong, and someone has to provide direction when both people are uncertain. These responsibilities naturally fall to whoever is better equipped to handle them, regardless of gender. In most successful relationships, men are better equipped to handle strategic planning, risk assessment, and decision-making under pressure, while women are better equipped to handle emotional intelligence, social coordination, and relationship maintenance. These aren't absolute rules, but they reflect general patterns that work when honored rather than ignored. For men who recognize themselves in accommodation patterns, recovery requires strategic intervention that gradually restores healthy dynamics without creating unnecessary relationship trauma. This intervention must be carefully calibrated because dramatic changes in behavior can be as destabilizing as the original problems. The intervention begins with small authenticity tests, where you practice expressing preferences and making decisions in low-stakes situations. Maybe you choose the restaurant without asking for her input. Maybe you make weekend plans based on your interests. Maybe you maintain your gym schedule despite her preference for more together time. These tests serve multiple purposes. They help you practice being decisive and authentic after months or years of accommodation. They test her actual response to your leadership versus your fears about her response. They begin re-establishing your decision-making authority in areas where it should never have been surrendered. The intervention also requires emotional steadiness, where you remain calm and confident when she tests your newfound boundaries. She may express disappointment, frustration, or attempts to re-establish the old accommodation patterns. Your job is to remain pleasant but firm about your decisions. Most importantly, the intervention requires consistency over time, where you demonstrate that the changes are permanent rather than temporary. Women need to see that your leadership is reliable and trustworthy before they'll support it, which means maintaining your authenticity even when it creates short-term relationship tension. The intervention strategy also includes positive reinforcement, where you acknowledge and appreciate her support when she chooses to follow your leadership rather than resist it. This helps her understand that your increased assertiveness is about improving the relationship rather than controlling her. Sustainable relationships require what I call architectural thinking, where both people understand their roles, responsibilities, and areas of authority within the partnership. This architecture provides stability, reduces conflict, and creates the psychological safety that allows both people to thrive in their respective roles. The architecture begins with role clarity, where both people understand who is responsible for what decisions and areas of life management. This prevents the constant negotiation and power struggles that exhaust couples who haven't established clear frameworks for decision-making. Within this architecture, men typically take responsibility for strategic planning, financial leadership, career development, and major life decisions. Women typically take responsibility for social coordination, emotional intelligence, relationship maintenance, and domestic management. These aren't rigid rules, but general frameworks that work when both people understand and accept them. The architecture also requires mutual respect, where both people value each other's contributions and areas of expertise without trying to micromanage or override each other's decisions. Men respect women's emotional intelligence and social skills. Women respect men's strategic thinking and decision-making capabilities. Most importantly, the architecture includes support systems, where both people actively help each other succeed in their respective roles, rather than competing for control or undermining each other's authority. Men support women's social and emotional needs. Women support men's leadership and decision-making authority. This architectural approach creates relationships that feel stable, functional, and satisfying for both people, because everyone knows their role, understands their value, and feels respected for their contributions to the partnership. Men who have fallen into accommodation traps can recover their leadership and restore healthy relationship dynamics, but the process requires patience, consistency, and realistic expectations about how long meaningful change takes to implement and stabilize. The first phase is recognition and commitment, where you honestly assess how much of your authentic self you've sacrificed and commit to the sometimes uncomfortable process of reclaiming your leadership. This phase can be emotionally difficult because it requires acknowledging how far you've drifted from your natural personality. The second phase is small changes and testing, where you begin asserting preferences and making decisions in low-stakes areas while monitoring both your comfort level and her responses. This phase typically lasts several months and involves gradually expanding your areas of independent decision-making. The third phase is resistance and consistency, where she tests your commitment to change by escalating emotional pressure, expressing disappointment, or attempting to re-establish old accommodation patterns. Your job during this phase is to remain consistent with your new boundaries, regardless of temporary relationship tension. The fourth phase is acceptance and stabilization, where she begins to accept and support your leadership once she understands that the changes are permanent rather than temporary. This phase often includes increased attraction and respect as she experiences the benefits of being with a man who maintains his authenticity. The final phase is integration and optimization, where the new dynamics become natural and automatic for both of you. The relationship operates smoothly within the new framework, and both people feel satisfied with their roles and the overall partnership structure. Throughout this timeline, it's crucial to maintain perspective about temporary discomfort versus long-term relationship health. Short-term tension during the transition is normal and necessary for creating the conditions that generate long-term satisfaction and attraction. If this analysis has helped you understand how accommodation patterns destroy relationships and want to learn more about developing authentic leadership that creates lasting attraction and respect, subscribe to this channel for more insights into relationship psychology, attraction dynamics, and strategic thinking about modern partnerships. Hit that notification bell because understanding these patterns could be the difference between relationships that slowly die through accommodation and relationships that thrive through authentic leadership. Share this video with any man who needs to understand that being a good partner doesn't mean sacrificing your authentic self to manage someone else's emotions. The goal isn't to become controlling or dismissive of her needs and preferences, but to understand that healthy relationships require one person to take responsibility for leadership, while the other person chooses to support that leadership. When both people understand and accept their roles, relationships become more satisfying, more stable, and more sustainable over time. The trap that destroys most modern relationships isn't lack of love, poor communication, or incompatibility. It's the gradual erosion of natural dynamics that create attraction and respect. Men who understand this dynamic can avoid the trap entirely or escape it once they recognize the patterns that lead to relationship death through accommodation. The most successful relationships are those where men maintain their authentic leadership throughout the natural evolution of emotional investment, and where women choose to support that leadership because they are attracted to and respect men who maintain their integrity under pressure. This creates partnerships that satisfy both people's deepest needs for attraction, security, and mutual respect.